So I am a lecturer at the University of Central Lancashire, and I am a dental anthropologist and archaeologist. So I do both the digging and I look at bones and teeth for clues to how people lived and died in the past. And my PhD is very specifically in teeth, so you will get quite a lot of tooth chat. Apologies in advance. But this is a talk about a book I wrote a couple years ago, but it's sort of one of my major interests in research, which is how humans grow. Because it turns out that humans, as many of you probably suspected, are very, very strange animals indeed. So let's talk about what it means to grow up human. And we will attempt to use, I'm very bad at using a mouse. My students laugh at me. There we go. And do pop in and let me know if my slides don't work. But I'm going to talk about childhood. And I'm going to talk about a particular type of child and concept of childhood. And I'm going to think about childhood in terms of investment. When you as an organism are being invested in, rather than when, some other time in your life where you're not a net resource sink. For a lot of people, we have childhoods that may last quite a long time, particularly humans. And my interest is in understanding why it is that human childhoods in particular require so much investment over such a long, long time. And to do that, we're going to sort of go back to a sort of almost ecological framework. We're going to think about how animals make strategies to invest in their offspring. And there are a couple different strategies you could choose as an animal, how you would invest in the next generation. You could invest in gestation. And so we have little animals like altricial ones and precocial ones. These are our science terms. But altricial animals are, of course, are adorable little kittens and puppies, eyes closed, ears closed when they're born, not very good at things, versus precocial animals like a giraffe, born ready to run. Everyone always says humans are altricial, by the way, but we are born with our eyes and ears open. So we're not technically. Infancy is another period when animals can invest a lot. Most mammals have really gone hard on infancy. We have milk is a special adaptation to invest in an infant. But infancy is our sort of period of care independence. We can put more investment in that period. Or an animal can choose to invest in growth, can put all of their money down on getting big, on being able to compete with other animals. A lot of times you have two different strategies. Males and females will have different strategies in terms of how big to get. They'll end up with size differences between them. And of course, you can invest in reproduction and kind of the mature phase of life. You can put a lot of effort into the process of making new ones of you. So these are our sort of different time periods that we can put investment in as an animal species. And we're going to look at the very odd choices that humans have made. So one of the things to sort of think about in this framework is you've got a couple different approaches. Something like a spider has, a shotgun approach to investment in children. You're going to have lots and lots of them. They're not going to require care after they're born. They're going to be born perfectly formed and able to go off and forage for themselves. That's the exact opposite of something like a human, which spends an enormous amount of time and energy growing one little baby, and they're going to then spend an enormous amount of time and energy making sure that it survives to adulthood. So we have different frameworks for how species choose to invest in their childhood. And humans, unsurprisingly, are pretty off the charts. If you think about how many calories per day it actually costs to grow a human, we're quite expensive. So this is us against the rest of the great apes. Sorry for all the numbers on the slide. I promise that it's in the book if you want to look it up, and I'm sure it's online if you want to find it. But humans have a very expensive process of growing a baby and then nursing it. We cost about 313 calories a day to grow. And a lot of that is spent building one particular expensive item which is our massive human brain. Our other great ape relatives don't put that much expense into their children. You can look at the individual calorie counts, but basically, if you're growing something like a chimpanzee, it only costs you 184 calories a day, but you are going to end up with a much cheaper version of brain if you go down that route. The other thing to think about here is that we're making these investments slightly more often. You may have noticed that there are rather more people on the planet than orangutans. It's not entirely the orangutan's fault, but we actually reproduce very quickly. We are very, very fast off the breast and on to the next baby. So orangutans, they will nurse their children for up to 7 years. And if you think about how these things scale in the animal kingdom, you think animals with about the same lifestyle and about the same sort of body size, they'll have the same patterns. We actually kick our kids off probably around 4 years old is probably what people think people would have done in the past. But this is a much shorter birth interval that allows our species to reproduce much faster. We're not having a baby every 7 years. We're having a baby every 4 years and then every 2 once we get into farming, which was what allows us to be the most successful, certainly in numbers terms, overall quality, we're not sure yet, but the most successful primate on the planet. And a really interesting thing is we can trace why this is. We can look at these investments. We can look at why we spend so much money growing our babies because we have clues. And these are my kind of clues. These are the clues that are locked into bones and teeth. So what you're looking at here on the screen are 2 species, both alike in dignity. One is a chimpanzee, the smaller one there is a chimpanzee, and the other one is a human. Those are the skeletons, and the little numbers scattered around tell you when the bones of that particular species take their final adult form. So, as you might imagine, we don't all instantly sort of appear fully formed or full adult size. There's a whole process of growing. But we know from a lot of previous research how that schedule goes. And we can look at something like us and say, right, okay, well, for girls, and girls are always ahead of the boys, sorry, that's just biology, 15 to 16 years is when that shoulder joint, all the bones there start firming up, taking their full adult form. For boys, it's closer to 19 years old. We can compare that to the chimpanzee, our closest living relative, and that chimpanzee is going to have that same level of growth achieved in only 9 to 10 years. That's half the time it took to grow the human. So we can look at an ape-like childhood, which is pretty fast compared to the very, very long period of growth that it takes to make something like a human. And there's a big, long story behind that, which of course we'll get into. So to give you an idea of the clues we are using, these are your bones. So this is what archaeologists and anthropologists will use. And for those of you who've probably done archaeology interest group or looked at some of these things, these might be familiar to you. But you are actually born with a sort of stick figure outline of your eventual skeleton. You have essentially a long bone. It's a bit like an iron pipe with, washers that screw on the end or something like that. But the ends of your bone are not fully fused. They can't be fused on because obviously your bone needs to get bigger so you can get taller and be the right size for the animal you need to be. So throughout your life, your bones are in a process of growing and the ends of them are not quite solidified. Of course, we know about this and we have a beautiful schedule of when this happens in our species. So when we dig something up out of the ground and find a bone where the end is yay big and not attached, or the end is yay big and not attached, we can start to put a chronology on it. We can start to put an age on it. So this is the method that we use to establish the age of a subadult, of someone who's not fully grown. Once you're an adult, sadly, it's all about signs of decrepitude. which is a depressing topic that I don't want to talk about here, so we won't, because I'm interested in child growth. So we have clues from the skeleton to give us an idea of how fast the skeleton is growing and how long. And of course, it was always going to come back to teeth because it's me talking. We have an incredible schedule that's locked into our mouths. This is incredibly regular dental development. So I'm sure many of you know this, but children are in fact sharks. They have multiple rows of teeth. Your teeth actually begin growing at about 30 weeks in utero. So you start growing the very tippy tops of your baby teeth, your front baby teeth, when you are still in your mother's stomach. So if you ever see into the mouth of a kid who's still got their little baby teeth, you can look at the top of their teeth and go, that is a record of your life when you were still in your mother's stomach. And that goes right the way through up to everyone's least favorite tooth, the wisdom tooth. So it's a record of regular growth of teeth. You've got your baby teeth, what stage they're at versus the adult teeth that are growing underneath in little crypts in your jaw, getting bigger and bigger. When we find a subadult skeleton, we can put them on this really quite exact scale. When you're really little, it's very tight, it's about 3 months. And when you're older, it's sort of 6 to 7 months off, 6 to 9 months off. But you can actually work out how old you are on a really tight schedule just based on which teeth are present in the jaw. So this gives us 2 schedules that we can use to look at how old something that we've dug up is, which is really very useful because we know that we didn't always look like this. We weren't always Homo sapiens. We have a long, long evolutionary history. It starts way back with tree shrews and goes right the way to us. And we're not entirely sure of the steps that we took to get here. This is the reason that I find it so interesting to look at childhood in particularly, because how fast we grow seems to be an evolutionary story. Let me tell you why. We'll give you 2 fossil examples. Everyone remembers Lucy? Lucy the fossil. She's an Australopithecus. Lucy in the sky with diamonds, or rather Lucy in the dirt with fossils. So Lucy's our most famous version of Australopithecus africanus, which is a African ape-ish that lived about 2 to 4 million years ago. And tongue child is a subadult fossil. So subadult fossils are incredibly important because they're very rare, but they give us a unique ability to look at that schedule of growth in the animals that came before us. So tongue child, we have a lovely jaw. You can look at how that development schedule is with the teeth. If tongue child had been a human, it would be about 6 years old. Now you can look at the picture of the tongue child that's cast there, and you can see that in that hand, it's a very small fossil. It's a very small animal. And the eagle is there just to, I think, rub in the fact that tongue child fossil was actually found in a cave, and on top of its skull, it has 3 rather perfect perforations. Which does rather suggest the reason for the end of tongue child. And actually, golden eagles, which are common in South Africa, are very, very much known to predate on poor unfortunate primates. Could have been a cave lion, but the eagle's there for a reason. And then I'll give you a second example, which is sometimes called Turkana boy, but this fossil is called Nariokotome boy, and this is Homo erectus. So this is firmly into our Homo lineage. It's 1 to 2 million years old-ish. We can all fight about that later. But Homo erectus is much closer to us. It's probably about our size. Looks a bit different, brain's a bit small, but Homo erectus is much closer to, it walks upright, it's much closer to what we think of as kind of a Homo species. And we have this lovely full skeleton with teeth. So not only do we have the schedule of growth that's locked into the teeth and jaws, we have the skeleton, so we can look at that schedule of growth. Now, if you look at that bone that's on the slide, there's a really nice bit where you can see the lines on it. The lines are where the ends of the bones are screwing down. Those ends that are supposed to grow and then eventually they solidify. So we can see very clearly the process of fusion and know that this isn't an adult skeleton. It's still in that process of growth. If we found a human body with all the traits of Narikatome boy, we would think they were about 11 to 12 years old. Well, this is all very good. We have a schedule. We can guess how old these fossils were. But what this doesn't tell us is, are they growing like our ape ancestors, like the chimpanzee, or are they growing like us, slow? When did we get these intense human childhoods? For that, you need more science and more teeth. Yes, you're welcome, more teeth. You need a clock. And you actually have one. You have a beautiful fossil record of every single day that your teeth grew, and it is locked into your dentition. This is a model of how teeth grow. So teeth have really regular formation, which is great. It's very strongly genetically controlled. Excellent for dental anthropologists like me, because if I were to slice into your tooth and look at it, I would see that the tooth forms almost like an onion. It has a little top sort of ring, and then a second set of leaves and a second set of leaves. These leaves all leave beautiful marks on the outside of your teeth. For most of us here, those little waves on the outside of the teeth, they're very tiny, they're microscopic, and when you brush your teeth regularly, they do disappear. Usually by the time you're about 18, you can't see them on the outside anymore. You have to use a microscope. But if we look at them in young people, we can relate those to an almost about weekly scale of growth. And then we can go inside. And we have these lovely things called cross striations. A cross striation is one little enamel-forming cell, one cell in your body, and it goes bloop, 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 and lays down the hard white stuff that's going to become the outside of your teeth. It goes in a nice little track, and every 24 hours, it has a little bit of a rest. That rest leaves a line, and I can see that line in a microscope and count how many days that cell was active. If we find a tooth that is only half finished, it means we can count how many days that tooth took to grow. Forensics actually use this with child remains in order to get an almost exact age at death. But of course, you need something to start with to get your exact clock, which is why there is a red line on the sort of sideways picture of the inside of a tooth that you're looking at there. There is something that happens to your body that is so traumatic, it actually rattles the cells badly enough to leave a permanent scar in the tissue. It has, and this is what I study, actually. This is my real mastermind topic. But this scar forms in every single person who is ever born, because they've all been through the universally traumatizing experience of birth. But the great news is, if everybody has this line, which is called the neonatal line, that gives us an absolute timing for birth, it means we can count day by day by day. How long did a tooth in a Tong child take to form? Is it the same number of little ameloblast cells, going on their 24-hour journeys, as it would be for a human? Did Tong child, for instance, grow fast or slow? And just give you a quick answer, they grew fast. Our immediate ancestors, they come from an ape-like pattern, which didn't have nearly as long a childhood as we do. So Tong child is actually really probably only about 3 years old, but it's got to the size of a 6-year-old because it has a shorter childhood. Homo erectus, a little bit later, a little bit closer to us, growing a little bit slower, but still probably 7 to 8 years, not 11 to 12. So we can actually look at this as a pattern of an extending childhood, which we've chosen down our evolutionary path. We've actually been evolving this intense, long childhood. And it is intense. This is a famous primatology graph, but we have an incredibly long period where we're being invested in rather than necessarily being the people who are investing. And this is an interesting question. What are we doing with our long childhoods? What are we doing in each of these phases? Well, infancy, we actually don't spend that much time in. We talked about being kicked off the breast early. A lot of what we're doing is just clinging on to our mothers in the infancy period. But rapidly, we find that we need to turn to the next child and we leave the infancy period behind. And I love the idea that infancy is sort of the period where we're learning directly from our mothers. These, by the way, are vervet monkeys who got taught to only ever eat pink corn. They don't know why, but their mothers taught them that. And even though the blue corn is fine, they wouldn't touch it. Sounds like my children. By the time you get to be a juvenile animal, which is the phase that we spend the longest in, you're doing some very important things to do. You are doing a lot of social learning. You are out and about with members of your group. We talk about what children do in terms of observation and peering. If you've ever seen a small child kind of going while you're doing something, that's a very, very animal thing to do. All sort of children do it. They're observing you, they're watching you, they're learning. And of course, learning through play is a major part of childhood. Chimpanzees actually quite fond of play, despite the fact they grow up to be really quite cranky and murderous. But this is a really important, this childhood period we've drawn out immensely. And I think it's really interesting that the species we became is a species that plays. We can look at two of our recent sort of divergences, so chimpanzees and bonobos. So these are two very identical looking species, but they behave very differently. They're both separated from us by millions of years. But chimpanzees, who grow up to be really not very playful. They're quite serious. They tend to hunt things. They have a lot of conflict, a lot of fighting. They play quite a bit as children, but they stop. They don't play really as adults. If they try to play, someone will fight them. Bonobos, who are very social, they answer every problem with sort of a group hug or more. Bonobos have an intense interest in play, so they play a lot as children, but they also play a lot as adults, which I think is a really interesting way of thinking about all of this time that we as a species are giving to our childhood to learning and the kind of play interactions that support us learning how to get along in our societies. So we have this sort of childhood learning phase where we've really put a lot of time and effort into being children. We're not the only primates to have done it. Other primates do transmit knowledge and share knowledge, particularly young animals who are moving about. If anyone's ever wondered what the evolutionary point of teenagers is, it is apparently to talk to their peers and share knowledge. This seems to be important across primates. These are the hot tubbing macaques of Hokkaido, if anyone knows about the snow monkeys. I don't know if anyone knows this, but the only reason that hot tub monkeys exist, that these snow monkeys go into these hot springs, is they're moved there because they used to be at a series of hotel onsen, hotel hot tubs. A resort was opened in the mountains in Hokkaido in the 1950s, and a couple of the resorts provisioned the monkeys. They started feeding them to be like a cute thing. They'd show up for the tourists, and an apple fell into an onsen, a hot tub. One juvenile female macaque chased it in and decided it didn't suck. And she actually is the one who then transmitted, because the females share a lot of information between her female peers and offspring. She's the one who taught the rest of them to hot tub. So generations later, they're all hot tubbing. The hotels want the monkeys out because they need the tourists in, and they all get forcibly removed to these hot springs, where now they can hot tub to their heart's content. But this does give us a sort of explanation for teenagers. And just to point out my other favorite teenage group, gorillas also have boy bands. We use social structures to share our knowledge across primates. So these are gorillas who have formed a boy band. Because they live in harems, there can be only one silverback. So what do the other males do? They go off and live in the forest with other males. But this is another way that the sort of juvenile individuals can share information, giving us another idea of what we can use our long childhoods for. Of course, one of the things that I'm really interested in is what that looks like in our species. I'm an archaeologist, secretly or not so secretly, depending on which of my classes you're taking. And I'm really interested in how our human species recently has used childhood. What do we use it for? And so I won't read this all out, but this is a cuneiform text. This is actually one of the earliest adoption texts in the entire world. This is an agreement between a priest, a priestess, and a sort of temple, where they've written down all of their obligations on taking in a foundling child. And this is, of course, something like 4,000 years old, this particular adoption. So we have a lot of ways of thinking about children, but often they're tempered by our own cultures and our own view of what is normal in terms of our species. We all think that, of course, well, some of us are more confident than others. People who write parenting advice manuals, usually top of that list. But we all think that we've got sort of, that there's a type of childhood that humans have that we're just built and designed to do. And I think one of the fascinating things we can do with archaeology is look at how different and how similar childhoods have been in other cultures, to see whether that really is, the childhood that we imagine today really is sort of our evolutionarily adapted childhood. And I think one of the most interesting things is this idea that actually in the past it was a different country and we didn't care about children much, which of course we know is not true. We wouldn't be here as a species if we didn't care about children. But we often read very cranky people like Plutarch particularly about not celebrating, little lives, that infants were not necessarily sort of treated as full people, and that we didn't pay a lot of attention. Of course, we know that's not true, but we have an amazing history of how we did care for them. This is a lovely example. This is a 3,000-year-old baby bottle. This little figurine, I like that it's got little rabbit ears and little feet. I'm not entirely sure what animal it's meant to be. Deer, maybe? You can put your guesses in the chat. But we have wonderful examples of people who, even when our sort of biological way of feeding children hasn't worked out, we as humans, clever little things we are, have come up with ways to try and keep our babies alive. Bottle feeding, wet nursing, which has been a very, very long tradition where a woman who's not the biological mother breastfeeds the child. This is a contract for wet nursing, because if you were anyone in the ancient world, obviously you had to hire a wet nurse. There's a wonderful cranky letter from a distraught mother-in-law to her son-in-law in Egypt, in Coptic Egypt, going, "I hope you're not expecting my daughter to breastfeed. I raised her better than that." And of course, we have to deal with the problems that come out the other side. It's very hard to uncover how people actually physically raised children in the past. But I really love some of these tiny votive figurines. So these are Greek terracottas. Sorry about the blurry image on the panel. We'll see a better image. But this is a swaddled child in ancient Greece. And look, cleverly, they've left the bum out. You don't want to have to re-swaddle all that often. This is a triumph of archaeology, and I'll take too much time, but I'll tell you this story. The excavations of the Agora at Athens. So 7th century BC, peak Greek life. There's the Agora, the marketplace, it's all happening. And they series of excavations. These are the ones from the 30s. And found lots and lots of archaeological treasures. This one prime among them. It is an object that no one could figure out. It looks like an upturned drum with a hole in it. However, in this period, they did have actually quite a lot of female archaeologists. They're often unsung. I'll mention them briefly at the other end. I have a secret project which is bringing the women who did digging back into the limelight. But sure enough, after being very confused by this particular ritual vessel, at some point, a woman excavator looked over and said, "Do you know, I think that's a toddler potty." And sure enough, they promptly used it experimentally. Early experimental archaeology in the 30s, they documented it as well. Well done. This is a small Greek child whose name is not left in the record. He was unimpressed with the object and he did cry. But this is Elizabeth Rosemary Camp, who I believe is the offspring of one of the excavators, who apparently successfully used the toddler potty from the 7th century. This is in the Athens Museum, by the way. If you ever go, please do find it. It's my favorite artifact. And of course, we do know that things like these did exist. There are figurative representations, and actually here, if you look at this, it's very clear that this is, a high chair or toddler potty. You don't know. You could use it anyway. There are mass-produced rattles from ceramics found in Athens as well. So, the toy industry was alive and kicking in the 7th century. But not everything that we look at is the kind of child's play that we think of. Dolls are a particular example I always like. So we have to think that in the past, people would be playing with things, but we might not always find them. If anyone's ever, these are very American, but corn husk dolls and apple face dolls. So these are when you tie little bits of corn husk, maybe stick a wizened apple core in the face, in for the head. These are traditional folk dolls that you make in the States. Obviously, these are not going to survive thousands and thousands of years. Whereas something that's nice and ceramic, like this beautiful jointed Kore doll, would survive. But something like the Kore doll actually might be too nice to be a toy. That, we think, has got quite a ritual purpose. It's something that is only ever found with teenage girls, or ritually deposited in a temple. So it might be something that's associated with a particular phase of life and then is sort of, ritually deposited once the girl has got married or moved on to the next phase of her life. And we have this question quite often. We find these little figurines. Do they represent offerings, or are they something you could play with? This little wheeled cart, I think, is one of my favorites because it's found in a midden. It's basically found in a trash pile, and it was found in Harappa, so this is an Indus Valley civilization, and it's found inside this chatty full of trash, and it's the cart. And then as they went through the bin, they eventually found the missing wheel. They could have put it back together if only they'd tried harder. But all of these different aspects of play kind of tell us about the society that we're going to live in and what we as an animal are doing with our play. So we talked about the chimpanzees and bonobos having different types of play. Human societies also have very different types of play. You play differently depending on the adult role your society needs to have you play. So a lot of work with Bayaka people who live in Congo. Some of them are settled farmers and some of them are hunter-gatherers. The hunter-gatherers have less gender roles. They have less sort of rules about what you have to do as an adult because everyone kind of does the same thing. And sure enough, their children, when they play, have less gendered play. They don't just play with girls, just play with boys. They don't play just girl games or just boy games. Whereas their counterparts, who are sort of culturally same language group, same people, they actually have far more gendered play earlier in their lives as younger and younger children, because the roles they need to play as adults involve an aspect of gendered division. And it's really, really interesting to think about as we go through the record and look for these kinds of, evidence of what society are we training our children to be part of. And we have these lovely toys. Will we find them everywhere? No, but some of my favorites are whistles. Those are very common. Little carts and animals, that's very common. Game pieces, those aren't always just for kids. Sheep knuckles, which you can gamble with. And this is from a site I excavated off in Turkey. It's beautiful board game type pieces, game of sort of pigs and dogs. We all fight over which animal that is. Everyone's decided it's a pig. I thought it was a hedgehog, but never mind. And of course, the story of the world's most satisfying archaeological find, because the game board, these game pieces, world's earliest game pieces, found, I think, in 2013. And in 2015, while I was on site, we found the missing piece 5,000 years later. That was satisfying. That was very satisfying. And of course, we have different types of play for different types of careers. We have kids who are going to have to grow up to learn specific tasks. We can see this in the archaeological record. We can see terrible pottery made by tiny little hands. They measure the width of the fingerprints that are stuck in clay to work out who's made them. This applies to, of course, learning specialist trade, writing, art. These are ostraca. So instead of scrap paper in Egypt, because paper is very expensive, you have scrap pottery, which is what people practice their letters on. Look at the amount of times people have practiced this particular stroke. Or, they've rewritten the same letter over here many, many times. I'm not entirely sure what the graffiti drawing is, but clearly, these are children practicing for the trades and skills they're going to need as adults. And as our societies get super specialized, we see this more and more as we go into societies that have very different roles for very different people. We see this more and more. These are graffiti from Pompeii, the ones they think are drawn by children. A lot of them have animals. And one of the suggestions is that one of the particular jobs for children would be taking care of the household animals, going off feeding the chickens, making sure the sheep are where they're supposed to be. This is one of my favorite specialized childhood jobs. This is date-picking baboon trainer, which is a job you could have as a small child. In ancient Egypt, these are baboons. Baboons, by the way, are particularly fierce. And they would get either old men or young boys who would basically be in charge of sending these baboons up a tree to knock down dates. And then, it's much more convenient than you climbing the tree. But that was a job you could have. Here are the beautiful sort of religious motifs from Akrotiri. This is on Santorini. This is a Minoan sort of civilization. And here are young women. You can tell by their hairstyle that they're teenagers. And they're picking saffron, which is really important for religious rituals. So they're probably training to be priestesses. They're going to be in a sort of temple economy. This is a very specialized job indeed. Of course, not everyone gets to pick saffron and be a priestess. And this is a serious sort of topic that comes up more and more as our societies get more specialized, is that we have children who have and children who have not. This is a shoe found inside a salt mine in Hallstatt in Austria. Also, in this salt mine, there are small caps. And in the cemetery, there are very clearly bodies of children who worked extremely, extremely hard in their lives. You can see from the effects on their bones that they carried heavy loads and lived very, very harsh lives. So these are stories as we get into a world that requires wages, that requires labors, of children in the have-nots as well as the haves. And of course, you get our very particular type of last stage of childhood, which I think is an interesting phase because it can go on for quite some time, as I believe everyone who is currently here still having an education will agree. That education as a period of childhood, I don't know if it's always associated with childhood, but a period where you are still absorbing investment. And I like the idea that our species spends a very long time in this. This is something called School Days, and this is a classic text. We've had tons of versions of it, so it's clearly something that you learn and repeat a little bit, like a famous nursery rhyme or something. And it's about going to Sumerian school because it's written by Akkadians who have to go and learn their Sumerian because the organizational language, it's like medieval Europe, everything's in Latin. You can't be a scribe unless you know Latin, and you have to go to scribe school in order to do your Latin, but everyone hates Latin. But this whole story, it writes out this poor schoolboy's days, and he gets up late, and his mother's forgotten his lunch, and she sends him to school without lunch, and then he goes into school, and he gets caned for being late. And then he goes into school and he does his homework is bad. He gets caned. His handwriting is bad. He gets caned. He speaks out of turn. He gets caned. Kind of goes on like that. He has a very bad day at school, and he does get caned an awful lot. We do frown on that these days, but for for a particular generation that this would apply to, then this is perhaps not that far out of recent memory. But this kind of education is, of course, only available to those on the other side, those that have. And I think that's actually one of my sort of really interesting ideas, is like, why do we only have some people who get that education? So in my last little few minutes, I'm going to give a tiny idea about the last little bit of our lives. It's not really about childhood, but let's think about how long we spend as children and how long we spend not as children, because there's a whole other bit of life that we haven't talked about that is very, very, very strange. And it comes in the second bit. We can think about growth in children, and we can think about clicking up. There we go. We can think about, how long we spend in childhood, but there's a whole other bit of life that humans have that almost no other people have, which is a non-reproductive adulthood. What kind of species would spend so long not having kids? This gives us the most radical human invention ever, which is, of course, the grandmother, the non-reproductive adult. Now, I'm not going to specifically talk about grandfathers. I know grandfathers are also important, but a lot of how we think about our species has to do with how long we spend in childhood, and then this extra bit that we've spent all our time on, because it's absolutely wild. Other species don't do this. Very few actually do. This is these are sort of a handful of species who do. These are the danger dolphins, the toothed whales, so orcas, narwhals. These are the other animals that go through a menopause. No other animal, except for one, goes through a chemical menopause where you can actually measure that they've gone beyond reproduction. Elephants, big animal, similar size, they actually keep on producing eggs right to the bitter end. How did we get weirder than a narwhal? We actually have such a huge amount of our life that's given over to childhood. It's incredible to think that we're going to spend another bit of it not reproducing. So if a narwhal lives to about 100 and they stop reproducing at 68, how incredible is it that we live about the same amount of time, but we actually finish off maximum 56? What is going on? If 50% of our life is non-reproductive, what on earth are we investing in? This is the grandmother hypothesis, the idea that a lot of post-reproductive life is meant to be there to help your genes pass on. So you're out there slaving away for the grandkids, and this can apply to grandfathers as well, investing in the next generation. And this is what we thought, really, when we thought this was a massive human adaptation, and only humans. We know that toothed whale grandmas, particularly orcas, do help their grandsons in particular. They help them by basically knowing where food is. So it's a lot of shared knowledge. But in 2023, we found chimps that have an exceptionally good diet. They basically dumpster dive. They're doing very well. And they live beyond reproduction too. And you know what they don't do? Grandmother. No, not for them. They're doing other things. They're busy. They're very busy. They are obviously somehow evolutionarily sort of selecting for themselves without this sort of grandmothering necessity. And it's fascinating because we still don't know what's going on with humans. Are we extending our lives just by having great nutrition? Are we particularly extending childhood? Why is this post-reproductive phase so early? If we look at something like a bowhead whale, we have the same length of childhood, but a bowhead whale is going to live 200 years, which we know because we found a harpoon head stuck in a bowhead whale, which was from Moby Dick days. So we have to think about childhood, why we spend so long in it. And one of the sort of issues is that we have very risky pregnancies, very risky sort of expensive childhood, spending those 313 calories. But that means we've got more parental investment, quicker off the breast and quicker into the arms of our allo parents, our societies, our big societies, our big groups, our dense human networks of aunties and uncles, and all the people who care for us and help support our very expensive offspring. So we've got a story of long, slow growth where we're learning to do things like hot tub and use an iPhone. But we still don't quite know the steps we took to get here, or, of course, where that's going. And I think it's worth thinking about that we only give this opportunity to have a long, long childhood in our modern societies to some people, that education is not always universally offered. If you think of schoolgirls in Afghanistan who are chucked out of school at 11, we as a society make choices about who has the chance to access some of these things. And I will go ahead and leave it there. Thank you so much for listening to me. I went slightly over time, but I'll leave you with a little address for my project with 3 other colleagues, which is telling some of the unsung stories of the women who contributed to the digging sciences. This is our project Trailblazers, about some of the amazing women whose stories really ought to be told. But thank you so much for listening.